You mean they just exist? Without broadcasting? High empath Valara's secondary tendrils writhed in distress, their bioluminescent tips flickering an alarming shade of chartreuse. That's impossible. Every sentient species broadcasts their thoughts. It's fundamental to consciousness itself. First contact specialist Zixtal adjusted his ceremonial thought dampeners, the crystalline devices humming softly as they reduced the overwhelming tide of panic emanating from his superior. With all due respect, High Empath, the evidence is irrefutable. The humans don't broadcast and they can't receive. They're completely psychically null. But how do they think? Valara's primary consciousness rippled with genuine confusion, a sensation that spread through the assembled empaths like ripples in a pond. How do they exist without the collective resonance? They think just fine, Zixtal said, his own thoughts carefully controlled through years of diplomatic training. They simply do it, internally. The concept sent another wave of discomfort through the chamber of communion. The gathered empaths shifted uneasily in their hover couches, their various appendages twitching as they struggled to process this fundamental violation of their understanding of the universe. Internal thoughts? Third empath Nexvir practically spat the words, both physically and psychically, like some kind of thought prison, trapped inside their own minds with no release, no sharing, no communion. The horror in their broadcast was enough to make several junior empaths excuse themselves from the chamber. Zixtal had expected this reaction. He'd spent the last 3 standard cycles studying humanity, and he'd had similar responses at first. But now he understood why the humans had survived, even thrived, despite their apparent disability. They compensate with extraordinary technological and social adaptations, he explained, projecting calm reassurance into his thoughts. They've developed complex verbal and written language systems, sophisticated non-psychic communication protocols, and remarkably advanced encryption technologies. Encryption? Valara interrupted, her horror shifting to something closer to offense. You mean they deliberately hide their thoughts from each other? Even beyond their natural deficiency? Yes, High Empath. Privacy is a cornerstone of their civilization. They consider the ability to keep thoughts secret to be a fundamental right. The chamber erupted in a chaos of projected emotions and thoughts, a storm of disbelief, disgust, and fear that made the thought dampeners whine in protest. Zixtal waited patiently for the initial shock to subside before continuing. There's more, he said, knowing this next part would be even more difficult for them to accept. Their military strategists consider this psychic nullity to be one of their greatest advantages. They've developed entire doctrines around the concept of operational security, the deliberate concealment of intentions and capabilities. Valara's color shifted to a deep indigo of dread. Are you suggesting they see their condition as a weapon? Not exactly, High Empath, but they are aware that other species find their psychic silence unsettling, and they're not above using that reaction to their advantage. The memory of his first meeting with a human diplomatic team flashed through Zixtal's mind before he could suppress it. The other empaths caught the edge of it, the eerie sensation of standing in a room with thinking beings who projected nothing, like psychic black holes in the usual tapestry of consciousness. Several of the younger empaths shuddered. We need to revise our diplomatic protocols immediately, Valara declared, her thoughts sharp with decision. If they can't be read, how can we trust any agreements? How can we verify their intentions? How can we... The chamber's emergency sensors blared to life, cutting off her broadcast. Red warning lights pulsed as the automated system announced. Attention. Unknown vessels detected entering restricted space. Multiple contacts. Non-standard drive signatures. No psychic emissions detected. The panic in the chamber was instant and overwhelming. Zixtal's thought dampeners overloaded with a sharp crack, leaving him exposed to the full blast of terror from the assembled empaths. They're here, someone broadcast. The silent ones are here. Why are they here? What do they want? Another thought screamed across the collective consciousness. We can't read them. We can't know their intentions. Valara's voice cut through the chaos, both verbal and psychic. First contact specialist Zixtal. You've dealt with them before. What are they planning? Zixtal would have laughed if the situation weren't so serious. High Empath. That's exactly the reaction they're counting on. This is likely a response to our recent expansion into the Orion Spur. They're demonstrating that they can reach us, while knowing we cannot read their intentions. It's barbaric, Nexvir broadcast, to deliberately provoke such uncertainty. From their perspective, our ability to read thoughts is equally disturbing, Zixtal pointed out. They value their mental privacy as much as we value our mental communion. The warning sensors updated their information. The human vessels had taken up position just outside the designated security perimeter. They weren't broadcasting any messages, psychic or otherwise. They were simply waiting. The chamber descended into chaos again. But Zixtal noticed something interesting. The younger empaths, those who had grown up hearing stories about humanity, were responding differently. Their fear was tempered with curiosity, even excitement. They're just sitting there, thinking things we can't know about, one young empath broadcast, their thoughts tinged with fascination rather than fear. Like signal-proof boxes floating in space, another added, attempting to process the concept through familiar metaphors. Valara's tendrils had shifted to a mottled pattern of stress colors. We need to establish communication immediately. Standard protocols. Won't work, Zixtal interrupted, knowing he was breaking about 17 different protocols himself. High empath, they're waiting for us to use their preferred communication methods. They want us to call them on their terms. Their terms? The concept seemed to physically pain her. But how can we trust? That's exactly the point they're making, Zixtal said. They live their entire lives unable to read each other's thoughts, yet they've built a civilization on trust without telepathy. They're showing us that it's possible. The chamber fell silent, both verbally and psychically, as the implications sank in. It was young empath Kurtix who finally broadcast what they were all thinking. They're not actually attacking us, are they? This is a demonstration? A negotiating tactic, Zixtal confirmed. They're showing us that our reliance on psychic communication could be a weakness. That we need to learn to deal with the unknown, just as they do every day of their lives. Valara's colors gradually shifted toward the more reasonable shades of deep thought. Because to them, everyone is psychically silent. Everyone is like they are to us right now. Exactly, Zixtal said. And they've developed complex social and diplomatic structures to handle that uncertainty. They're not trying to terrorize us. They're trying to push us out of our comfort zone, to make us understand their perspective. The emergency sensors pinged again. A text-only message had been received from the human vessels. Ready to talk when you are. We bring greetings and an interesting proposal regarding the Orion Spur situation. The assembled empaths caught the edge of Zixtal's amusement before he could contain it. Several of them broadcast questioning thoughts at him. They're teaching us something valuable, he explained. They're showing us that not being able to read someone's thoughts doesn't mean you can't understand them. Sometimes you have to simply talk. Talk? Valara's tendrils had finally settled into a more normal coloration. Just exchange words? Without knowing the thoughts behind them? Exactly. It's how they build trust. Gradually, through actions and words, not immediate thought sharing. They're offering us a chance to learn their way of doing things. The chamber was quiet again, but this time the silence had a different quality. The fear was still there, but it was being replaced by something else. Curiosity, understanding, even a hint of respect. So, Valara said finally, her thoughts stabilizing into something approaching diplomatic calm. You're saying we should respond to their message, even though we can't read their true intentions? Yes, Zixtal said, because that's exactly what they do every single day. Every conversation they have, every deal they make, every relationship they build, it's all done without psychic confirmation, and somehow they make it work. The younger empaths were broadcasting enthusiastic agreement now. Their earlier fear transformed into intellectual excitement. Even some of the older ones were coming around to the idea. Very well, Valara declared, her formal diplomatic colors asserting themselves. First Contact Specialist Zixtal, please compose a response to the humans. Tell them we are ready to talk. As Zixtal began drafting the message, he caught fragments of discussion from the assembled empaths, both verbal and psychic. They were already analyzing the implications, considering the possibilities, adapting to this new paradigm. Some were even expressing admiration for humanity's ability to function without what the empaths had always considered a crucial sense. The human vessels maintained their position, silent in both normal and psychic space, waiting patiently for a response. But now that silence felt less threatening and more interesting. A different way of being, a challenge to understand and adapt to, rather than fear. Zixtal sent the response. We acknowledge your message and accept your invitation to dialogue. Please proceed with your proposal. The human's reply came quickly. Excellent. Shall we discuss the art of understanding without reading minds? Several of the younger empaths actually laughed out loud at that, their psychic amusement spreading through the chamber like a warm wave. Even Valara's tendrils showed traces of humor purple. You know, Kurtix broadcast thoughtfully, maybe being psychically null isn't a disability at all. Maybe it's just different. And maybe different isn't always bad. The assembled empaths processed this idea, their collective consciousness shifting and adapting. The human vessels remained in position, their crews undoubtedly going about their business, thinking their private thoughts, completely unaware of the profound effect their simple presence was having on empath society. Or perhaps, Zixtal mused, they knew exactly what they were doing. After all, sometimes the most effective communication didn't require reading minds at all. Just an understanding of how others think, and the patience to let them come to their own conclusions. The next message from the humans simply read, "So, about that proposal." And for the first time in their history, the empaths were ready to truly listen, without trying to read between the thoughts. The human proposal, as it turned out, was both elegantly simple and terrifyingly complex, at least from the empath's perspective. You want to establish a joint military training program? Valara's tendrils twisted into the rare pattern that indicated simultaneous disbelief and intrigue. With your non-broadcasting personnel? The human on the main display screen, Admiral Helena Torres, smiled in what Zixtal had learned was meant to be a reassuring manner. Her dark eyes sparkled with what might have been amusement, though of course none of the empaths could actually tell. Exactly, she said. We believe it would be mutually beneficial. Your forces learn to operate effectively against psychically null opponents, and our personnel gain experience working with psychically active allies. The collective shudder that ran through the Chamber of Communion was almost visible. Nexvir's thoughts broadcast raw panic before they could contain themselves. Work directly with the Silent Ones, in combat situations? Admiral Torres's expression didn't change, but Zixtal thought he detected a slight tightening around her eyes. After 3 cycles of studying humans, he was getting better at reading their physical cues, a skill he now realized would be invaluable in the coming interactions. I understand your concern, Torres said diplomatically, but consider this. The galaxy is vast, and we're not the only psychically null species out there. Sooner or later, you'll encounter others like us. Wouldn't you rather learn to handle that situation in a controlled, friendly environment? Valara's colors shifted through several contemplative patterns before settling on a diplomatic azure. You make a logical point, Admiral, but surely you understand our hesitation. The very concept of operating alongside beings whose thoughts we cannot sense is exactly why this is necessary, Torres finished. Just as we've had to learn to work with psychically active species without being able to participate in your mental communion. Zixtal caught himself nodding in agreement before remembering it was a human gesture he'd picked up. Still, the Admiral's point was solid. He broadcast his support for the idea, carefully modulated to show respect for the High Empath's authority, while emphasizing the strategic advantages. If I may, he said aloud, for the humans' benefit, this could also help address the rising tensions in the Orion Spur. A joint training program would demonstrate both species' commitment to peaceful cooperation. Torres nodded. Exactly. And it might make certain other parties think twice about testing either of our borders. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Any potential adversaries would have to consider that they might face both the empath's psychic capabilities and humanity's unsettling psychic silence. The strategic advantages were obvious, even if the implementation would be challenging. There is merit to this proposal, Valara admitted. Her secondary tendrils had stopped writhing and now moved in the slow rhythmic pattern of deep analysis. But the practical aspects would be considerable. Our training methods rely heavily on psychic coordination. That's exactly why we're suggesting a small pilot program, Torres replied. 1 human frigate crew working with one of your tactical units. We start small, work out the protocols, and expand based on results. Young empath Kurtix, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly broadcast a burst of excitement that made several older empaths wince. Oh, like learning a new language. But instead of learning to broadcast thoughts, we learn to read human non-psychic cues. Torres's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Exactly. And we'll learn to better understand your psychic communication protocols, even if we can't participate directly. It's about building bridges between our different ways of experiencing the universe. Zixtal noticed something interesting. The younger empaths were now broadcasting patterns of curiosity and excitement that nearly matched the frequency of their earlier fear. The transformation was remarkable, and he filed it away as another example of humanity's peculiar talent for turning apparent weaknesses into strengths. Perhaps, Valara said slowly, her colors shifting toward the more positive end of the spectrum. We could begin with some simple joint exercises, non-combat scenarios, to establish baseline protocols. We'd be happy to start there, Torres agreed. In fact, we've prepared several proposed training scenarios that... The emergency sensors blared again, but this time the warning was different. Multiple unidentified vessels detected entering system. Non-standard drive signatures detected. Psychic emissions detected but encrypted. The chaos that erupted in the Chamber of Communion was immediate, but different from before. This time the fear was tinged with something else, determination. Encrypted psychic emissions? Nexvir broadcast. How is that even possible? The Vorkath, Torres said grimly, naming the aggressive species that had been pushing at both human and empath borders. They've been experimenting with psychic damping technology, trying to copy humanity's advantage artificially. But that's... Valara began. Impossible? Torres finished. No more impossible than humans evolving without psychic abilities in the first place. The question is, what are we going to do about it? The human vessels, which had maintained their passive stance at the system's edge, began powering up their systems. Not aggressively, Zixtal noted, but definitively. Well, Valara said, her diplomatic colors giving way to the deeper hues of decision. It seems we'll be field testing that joint training program sooner than anticipated. Torres's smile turned sharp. So it seems. Ready to find out how effective a combination of psychic broadcasting and psychic silence can be? The younger empaths were already broadcasting tactical suggestions, their thoughts full of possibilities for combining human and empath capabilities. The older ones, including Valara, were quickly moving past their initial hesitation as the tactical advantages became clear. First Contact Specialist Zixtal, Valara said formally. Please inform the Admiral that we accept both her initial proposal and her offer of immediate assistance. Zixtal didn't bother hiding his satisfaction as he relayed the message. The human vessels were already moving to support positions around the empath defense platforms, their crews thinking their unknowable thoughts, planning their unreadable strategies. And somehow that silence no longer seemed terrifying. If anything, it felt complimentary, like having an ally who could move through shadows while you commanded the light. The Vorkath vessels would soon learn an important lesson. There were things worse than being unable to read someone's thoughts, like facing an enemy who had mastered both the presence and absence of psychic communication. As the defense platforms powered up and the human vessels took their positions, Admiral Torres sent one final text message. Ready to show them why silence can be golden? The Chamber of Communion erupted in a wave of agreement, both verbal and psychic, and Zixtal realized that humanity had achieved something remarkable. They had transformed their greatest perceived weakness into a strength so compelling that others wanted to learn it. The Vorkath were about to discover exactly why you should never underestimate a species that had mastered the art of keeping their thoughts to themselves. The Vorkath attack came in waves of corrupted psychic static, their ships broadcasting artificially generated thought noise that made the empath defense grid operators wince in discomfort. But the humans didn't even blink. Fascinating, Torres commented over the secure channel. They're trying to replicate our natural silence with technology, but they're just creating psychic white noise instead. Messy. Messy but effective, Zixtal noted, watching several empath operators struggling to maintain their focus. Even with their training, the garbled psychic broadcasts were disorienting. Our defensive protocols weren't designed to handle this kind of interference. Then it's a good thing you've got some naturally interference-proof allies, Torres replied. Her fleet had already begun executing a complex maneuver that somehow managed to look both totally random and perfectly coordinated. Kartix, you still reading me through all that static? The young empath's voice came through clear despite the psychic chaos. Affirmative, Admiral. The human communication channels are completely unaffected by the Vorkath's interference. Of course they are, Valara broadcast, her thoughts cutting through the static with the clarity of long experience. The humans never needed psychic communication in the first place. They're immune to this strategy. The realization rippled through the empath fleet. The very trait they had found so disturbing in humans was now their greatest asset. The Vorkath's attempt to weaponize psychic silence was useless against an enemy who had evolved with it naturally. Permission to demonstrate why artificial silence isn't quite the same as the real thing? Torres asked, a hint of predatory amusement in her voice. Valara's tendrils flickered with decisive colors. Permission granted, Admiral. Show us what the Silent Ones can do. The human vessels moved with unprecedented coordination, executing maneuvers that seemed to make no sense until the moment they made perfect sense. Without any psychic broadcasts to intercept, the Vorkath had no way to anticipate their actions. "This is incredible," Kurtik's broadcast, their thoughts tinged with professional admiration. "They're using their silence as a form of stealth!" Zixtal watched as the human ships seemed to dance through space, their movements unpredictable yet precisely calculated. Not just stealth, he realized. They're creating patterns of movement that only make sense if you can't read their intentions. They've turned their psychic blindness into a tactical language. The Vorkath ships attempted to adjust their strategy, their artificial psychic dampening fields fluctuating as they tried to find a frequency that would work against the humans. But there was nothing to dampen. No thoughts to scramble, no psychic coordinates to disrupt. "Now this," Torres said with evident satisfaction, "is why you can't fake evolution. Ready for Phase 2, High Empath?" Valara's colors shifted to battle-ready crimson. "Ready, Admiral. All Empath vessels, execute Protocol Silent Partner." What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. The Empath fleet, instead of trying to filter out the Vorkath's psychic static, simply stopped broadcasting altogether. They switched to human-style communication channels and adopted pre-planned maneuvers that required no psychic coordination. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Vorkath, who had built their entire strategy around disrupting psychic communication, suddenly found themselves facing two fleets that might as well have been psychically null. "Impressive adaptation," Torres commented as the Empath ships fell into perfect formation alongside their human counterparts. "You're naturals at radio silence." "We had excellent teachers," Kurtix replied, their verbal response carrying the same enthusiastic tone that usually colored their thoughts. "Though I must admit, thinking without broadcasting feels like wearing a sensor-proof suit?" Naxavir suggested over the comm, surprising everyone with their use of a human metaphor. "More like learning to whisper," Zixtal added, watching as the combined fleet executed a pincer movement that the Vorkath couldn't possibly have anticipated. "We're not stopping our thoughts, we're just keeping them to ourselves." The Vorkath fleet's formation began to deteriorate as they realized their primary tactical advantage had been neutralized. Their artificial psychic dampening fields flickered erratically, now broadcasting confusion and alarm instead of coordinated static. "Should we show them what a real psychic attack looks like?" Valara asked, her voice carrying a hint of the same predatory tone that Torres had used earlier. "By all means," Torres replied. "Karatix, if you would do the honors." The young empath's excitement was almost palpable even without psychic broadcast. "Initiating Protocol Sudden Silence." The empath fleet's psychic dampeners, which had been quietly charging throughout the entire engagement, activated in perfect synchronization. But instead of generating random interference like the Vorkath's crude technology, they created a precisely calibrated wave of nothing. A bubble of perfect psychic silence, modeled after humanity's natural state, expanded outward from the empath ships. The Vorkath vessels, suddenly cut off from even their own psychic communications, fell into disarray. "Now that," Torres said with evident appreciation, "is how you weaponize silence." The next few minutes were almost anticlimactic. The Vorkath fleet, their coordination shattered and their crews presumably struggling with the unfamiliar sensation of complete psychic isolation, began a hasty retreat. "Should we pursue?" Kurtix asked, their voice trembling with the effort of containing their thoughts. "No need," Torres replied. "They've learned their lesson. You can't fake what we are, and you definitely shouldn't underestimate either natural silence or voluntary restraint." As the Vorkath ships fled the system, Valara's colors gradually shifted back to their diplomatic hues. "Admiral Torres, I believe we owe humanity an apology. We saw your psychic silence as a disadvantage, even a disability. We never considered that we might have developed other strengths to compensate," Torres finished. "Or that what looks like a weakness in one context might be a strength in another." "Indeed." Valara's tendrils moved in a pattern that Zixtal recognized as deep respect. "Your joint training proposal? I assume it would include instruction in these silent protocols?" "Among other things," Torres said. "We've learned a lot about working with psychically active species over the years. And clearly, you've got some interesting ideas about tactical applications of psychic silence. I'd say we both have plenty to teach each other." The Chamber of Communion, which had been maintaining commendable psychic discipline throughout the engagement, finally erupted in a controlled burst of excitement and curiosity. The younger empaths were already discussing potential applications of voluntary psychic silence, while the older ones were analyzing the tactical advantages of being able to switch between broadcast and silent operations. You know, Krathos said thoughtfully, maybe we should thank the Vorkath. Their attempt to artificially replicate humanity's traits just proved why the real thing is so much more valuable. Careful, Torres warned, though her tone was amused. That's dangerously close to saying that humans are special. Oh, but you are, Zixtal said, allowing himself to broadcast just a touch of his own appreciation. You're living proof that sometimes not having something everyone else considers essential can lead to developing something even better. Like the ability to keep a secret? Torres suggested. Like the ability to choose when to share and when to remain silent, Valara corrected. A lesson we are apparently only now learning, despite all our perceived advantages. The human vessels began powering down their combat systems, their crews presumably celebrating their victory in their own unknowable ways. The empath fleet maintained formation around them, but now the gaps in the psychic landscape where the human ships sat felt less like voids and more like points of quiet strength. So, Torres said, about that training program. Still interested? The response, both verbal and psychic, was unanimous. The empaths had learned a valuable lesson about the power of silence, and they were eager to learn more. After all, as humans had known all along, sometimes the most powerful message is the one you choose not to broadcast. 3 standard cycles after the Vorkath incident, the Joint Silent Operations Training Facility on Nexus Station had become the most fascinating experiment in interspecies cooperation the galaxy had ever seen. It was also, as Admiral Torres frequently noted, the quietest military installation in known space, both psychically and physically. You're still broadcasting, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez said, tapping his temple with a knowing smile as Krathos's practice squad moved through the combat simulation. Kartik's tendrils flushed with embarrassment. But I managed to maintain radio protocol this time. You did, Rodriguez agreed. Your verbal communication was perfect, but you're still leaking psychic chatter like a broken thought dampener. In a real combat situation, the enemy would know our position instantly, Krathos finished, their colors shifting to determined purple. Let me try again. Zixtal watched from the observation deck as the young empath led their squad through the exercise once more. This time, the psychic silence was almost perfect. Only the faintest whisper of concentration leaked through. They're learning fast, Torres said, joining him at the viewport. Faster than we expected. They're motivated, Zixtal replied. After the Vorkath encounter, every empath in the sector wanted to learn what they call the human art of mental stealth. We had to implement a lottery system for training slots. Torres chuckled. Mental stealth. I like that. Better than creepy psychic void, which is what the Vorkath apparently call us. Below them, Krathos's squad successfully completed their mission without broadcasting a single identifiable thought. The achievement was met with a burst of carefully controlled celebration, verbal cheers rather than the traditional psychic broadcast of triumph. You know what's really interesting? Zixtal said, watching the trainees. It's changing our culture, not just our tactics. The younger generation especially. They're starting to appreciate the value of, what do you call it? Privacy? Torres suggested. Personal space? The right to keep your thoughts to yourself? All of those. They're discovering that sometimes not sharing every thought can be liberating. Valara's voice came from behind them. It's also causing quite the stir in the Council of Elders. They turned to find the high empath floating in her ceremonial hover couch, her tendrils displaying a complex pattern that Zixtal had learned to interpret as amused concern. Problems? Torres asked. The opposite, actually. Valara gestured to the training floor below. They're worried about how enthusiastically our people are embracing these human concepts, particularly the idea that constant psychic broadcast might not be necessary for a functioning society. Are they afraid we're corrupting your youth? Torres's tone was light, but there was a serious undertone to her question. They're afraid we're evolving, Valara said simply. And they're right. Watch. She directed their attention to where Krathos was now instructing a mixed group of human and empath trainees. The young empath was demonstrating a technique they had developed, using minimal, focused psychic broadcasts as a tactical tool, rather than a constant state of being. Targeted telepathic bursts, Krathos was explaining, their voice clear through the observation deck speakers, like your radio transmissions, but psychic. Only broadcast what needs to be shared, when it needs to be shared. Holy shit! One of the human trainees exclaimed. You can actually do that? I thought it was all or nothing with psychic broadcasting. That's what we thought too, Krathos replied, their tendrils showing proud copper tones. But by studying how humans communicate, we realized our natural abilities could be more nuanced. Torres whistled low. They're not just learning to work with us. They're developing entirely new ways of using their abilities. Exactly, Valara said. The Council is split between those who see this as a natural evolution of our capabilities and those who view it as a dangerous departure from our traditional ways. And you? Zixtal asked, curious about his superior's personal view. I think, Valara said carefully, her colors shifting through thoughtful patterns, that any species that refuses to evolve eventually becomes extinct. The Vorkath taught us that our traditional reliance on constant psychic communication could be a weakness. Humanity is teaching us how to turn that potential weakness into a new kind of strength. Below them, a new exercise was beginning. Mixed teams of humans and empaths moved through the combat course, coordinating through a combination of radio commands, hand signals, and precisely targeted psychic pulses. Their efficiency was remarkable. They're calling it hybrid warfare, Torres said. The ability to operate in both psychically active and psychically silent modes, switching between them as needed. The strategic implications are significant, Zixtal noted. No other species has developed this capability. The Vorkath tried to artificially replicate human psychic silence and failed. We're learning to actually control and direct our psychic abilities in ways we never considered before. Speaking of the Vorkath, Valara said, her colors darkening slightly. Our long-range sensors detected their fleet approaching the Carina sector yesterday. Torres's posture shifted subtly. Testing whether our new cooperation is a fluke or a real tactical advantage? Most likely. Valara's tendrils moved in a pattern that somehow managed to convey both anticipation and concern. They've modified their ships since our last encounter. Better psychic dampening technology. Still missing the point, Torres said, shaking her head. They think this is about technology, about trying to replicate or counter natural abilities. They don't understand that it's about adaptation, about learning to work with what you have and don't have. Below them, Kratix's mixed squad had achieved a new facility record for the combat course. The celebration that followed was a curious blend of human and empath expressions of joy. Verbal whoops and cheers mixed with carefully controlled bursts of projected happiness. Should we tell them about the Vorkath? Zixtal asked, watching the trainees celebrate. Not yet, Valara decided, her colors settling into confident hues. Let them enjoy their achievement. They'll have plenty of opportunities to put their training to practical use soon enough. Torres nodded in agreement. Besides, I think our would-be adversaries are about to learn another important lesson about humanity and our allies. Oh? Valara's tendrils curled in curiosity. Sometimes, Torres said with a slight smile. The most terrifying thing isn't the silence itself, but what that silence is hiding. Zixtal found himself agreeing. The Vorkath, like many others, had misunderstood the true significance of humanity's psychic silence. They saw it as a trait to be copied, a technology to be replicated. They didn't understand that the real power lay not in the silence itself, but in what that silence had taught humanity about communication, trust, and adaptation. And now, with the empaths learning to bridge the gap between constant broadcast and tactical silence, that lesson was about to become even more significant. You know, Kratix called up from the training floor, their tendrils showing the copper-bright colors of inspiration. I think I finally understand why humans love the phrase actions speak louder than words. Oh? Rodriguez asked. Because sometimes, Kratix said, their thoughts completely contained for the first time since joining the program. The most powerful message is the one you choose not to send. The human trainees burst out laughing, while their empath counterparts broadcast carefully controlled appreciation of the joke. And in that moment, watching the two species work and laugh together, Zixtal realized that they had created something entirely new, a way of being that combined the best of both worlds. The Vorkath wouldn't just be facing humans now. They would be facing empaths who had learned the power of silence, and humans who had learned to work with psychically active allies. They would be facing an enemy that could shift between broadcast and silence at will, that could coordinate across both psychic and non-psychic channels. They would be facing the future, and the future, as it turned out, was surprisingly quiet.